Beneath the official histories lies a silence deeper than any battlefield grave. Secrets moved through rail tunnels and ruined bunkers, carried on whispered code names, and stamped in red ink before being buried forever. What was hidden was never meant to be found, because to know is to question, and to question is to confront the darkness nations agreed never to acknowledge. Some archives were sealed, others destroyed, but fragments remain, sharp enough to cut through the lies. On the night of February 11th, 1945, as Soviet forces pressed into Lower Silesia, a heavily guarded military train departed from Breslau's southern rail yard under the designation Operation Morgenlicht. Witness accounts describe it as a column of at least 12 cars, several flatbeds, armored wagons, and sealed freight containers reinforced with steel plating. The escort was comprised of elements from the 31st SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, men known for their fanatic loyalty even as the Reich collapsed. Records from the Reichsbahn indicate the train was scheduled to follow the Owl Mountains route, disappearing somewhere between Wałbrzych and Kłodzko. The Allies, particularly Soviet Army Group Konev, had every reason to monitor such a transport. Yet captured Red Army radio logs show no interception, no engagement, no evidence that the train ever reached its declared destination. The only physical clue lies in an obscure March 1945 Wehrmacht communique referencing Versorgungszug 77, Morgenlicht, Status unbekannt, unknown status. The file was buried among hundreds of end-phase war reports, but its designation carried a higher classification than most frontline unit reports. Polish villagers recalled strange movements in the weeks after. Families in the Owl Mountains region, particularly near the abandoned Ries tunnel networks, claimed that entire settlements were relocated for security measures. Survivors interviewed decades later spoke of Reich engineers detonating charges deep in the mountain passes, collapsing rail lines that had been perfectly intact days before. A farmer from the village of Jugowaisz described columns of smoke rising from sealed shafts and the smell of burning oil that lingered for weeks. Official post-war reconstruction records list the damage as accidental structural failure, though no witnesses ever reported accidents, only deliberate detonations. In the 1960s, Polish Security Service archives began referencing Acta SOA, the Owl Files. These classified documents, partially declassified in the late 1980s, detail a series of secret state-led excavations under the codename Project Widowice. Extraction. Crews reportedly unearthed remnants of rusted train tracks and collapsed tunnel entrances, but every mention of actual cargo is struck through with black ink. One memorandum, dated September 3, 1962, records the recovery of cylindrical steel containers marked with Reich insignia. The line immediately after is redacted, followed by a note. Transmitted to Ministry of Defense, Warsaw, for indefinite storage. Curiously, Soviet intelligence maintained parallel interest. A declassified KGB surveillance log from 1971 reveals Moscow had quietly dispatched its own geologists to the Owl Mountains. Their report, circulated internally under the file number GRUG947R, includes a chilling observation. Presence of underground voids consistent with extensive man-made tunnels, evidence of deliberate flooding, no trace of locomotives or rolling stock. Radiation anomalies recorded in shaft 12, origin unexplained. That report too was abruptly shelved. Western interest resurfaced in the early 1990s, following Poland's transition out of Soviet control. Newly empowered researchers sought to explore the mountains, fueled by rumors of Nazi gold trains. Excavations drew international media attention, but the findings were underwhelming. Scattered Wehrmacht helmets, corroded ammunition boxes, and fragments of rail sleepers. However, a privately circulated intelligence brief compiled by a NATO liaison officer stationed in Warsaw indicated that Polish military police had cordoned off certain shafts before public digs commenced. What they removed, if anything, remains classified. The absence of physical confirmation has fueled speculation for decades. Some historians argue the Morgenlicht train was no different from countless other Reich transports destroyed in the chaos of retreat. But the inconsistencies remain. The unusually high security classification, the unexplained forced relocations of entire mountain villages, the redacted Polish recovery notes. Why seal tunnels rather than simply abandon them? Why destroy functioning railways unless the objective was to ensure nothing emerged? One theory ties Morgenlicht to advanced weapons research. Captured SS correspondence from early 1945, filed under Amt 66S, discusses the emergency transfer of sensitive archives from Breslau to undisclosed mountain facilities. Allied scientific teams scouring the Reich after its surrender consistently complained of missing documents in fields ranging from uranium enrichment to cryptographic design. Could Morgenlicht have carried precisely these missing archives? And if so, were they destroyed or hidden for future retrieval? Another possibility lies in financial assets. Reichsbank gold convoys were documented fleeing eastward as Berlin collapsed. Yet the Morgenlicht train bore none of the hallmarks of standard gold transports. No Reichsbank guards, no civilian officials. Instead, its escort consisted of hardened Waffen-SS grenadiers. This detail alone suggests something more strategic than treasure, perhaps experimental war material, or files too sensitive to fall into Allied hands. The most haunting evidence remains a fragment from a 1963 Polish excavation report. Found among discarded documents in 1992, it includes a single sentence, partially legible despite attempts to erase it. Znaleziono dokumentację, operacje biologiczne, Owieska. Translation: documentation found, biological operations, Owieska. No such project is known in Reich archives. The page was never meant to survive. 70 years later, the mountains still hold their silence. Excavations are tightly regulated, official files remain redacted, and the fate of Operation Morgenlicht lingers in a fog of contradictions. A train that by all records existed, that by all logic should have been intercepted, and yet left behind only a trail of sealed tunnels, erased files, and whispered relocations. It was as if the Reich had buried not merely cargo, but a secret it believed would be too dangerous to surface in any future war. On July 14, 1947, an Anglo-American team under the discreet designation Unit Vireo began surveillance operations in the American-occupied sector of Frankfurt. The mission, documented in fragmented OSS and early CIA memoranda, was to track remnants of Nazi scientific personnel believed to have evaded Operation Paperclip screenings. Their specific quarry: men suspected of working on radiological delivery systems, munitions capable of contaminating entire cities without an explosive blast. The stakes, in the tense opening years of the Cold War, were deemed existential. The operation was triggered by an intercepted courier satchel retrieved in Stuttgart. Inside were chemical manifests, written in hurried cipher, listing quantities of uranium oxide, heavy mercury flasks, and unfamiliar notations referencing Project Nebelstrahl. Analysts struggled to decode the terms. What caught their attention was the use of ciphers associated with the SS Forschungskommando, the very bureau responsible for weapons innovations late in the war. The satchel also contained railway invoices, dated as late as April 1945, suggesting such cargo had been moved westward, even as Berlin was collapsing. Unit Vireo operated out of a commandeered hotel on Wilhelm Leuschner Strasse. Its personnel roster included veterans of OSS's counterintelligence branch, 2 Royal Engineers with experience in explosives recovery, and a single biochemist from Cambridge University. Their cover story, as recorded in British Foreign Office files, was Post-War Industrial Survey. In reality, they were conducting surveillance of abandoned Wehrmacht depots, interrogating suspected collaborators, and trailing suspected scientists, who had re-emerged under false identities. The team quickly uncovered evidence that more than just men had survived. In a bunker complex near Kassel, abandoned since 1945, they discovered sealed crates marked with Reich Eagle insignia and the designation Nur for Sondertransport. The crates contained what appeared to be cylindrical canisters lined with lead. The biochemist's field notes described faint radioactivity, enough to register on Geiger counters that had been hastily issued to the unit. Yet the contents themselves were never recorded in detail. A subsequent memorandum, stamped in red with the words "compromised by friendly forces," indicates that the discovery was appropriated within days by another American team with no relation to Unit Vireo. No chain of custody was maintained, and the crates disappeared into the labyrinth of occupation warehousing. Parallel to this, Unit Vireo was tracking a shadow network of couriers moving through Frankfurt's ruins. Informants indicated that former SS researchers were operating under assumed names, maintaining contact through encoded radio transmissions. Deciphered fragments suggested they were exchanging not only names, but design schematics. One intercepted transmission, designated Intercept 12B, included references to compacta quella, a compact source. Intelligence officers speculated this might mean a portable radiological emitter, a device crude but devastating. The transmission ended abruptly mid-code, as if cut off intentionally. In November 1947, the unit submitted its most comprehensive report to Allied command. The document, which survives only in fragments, warned of unauthorized possession of fissile precursors and evidence of weaponization research continuing post-surrender. Its recommendation was unambiguous. All suspected personnel and caches must be secured under immediate multinational oversight. Weeks later, Unit Vireo was dissolved. Its surviving members were reassigned, its files scattered among CIA archives, British MI6 holdings, and military police repositories. No central record exists today. Decades later, in the early 1980s, a retired CIA archivist revealed the existence of an unindexed storage crate labeled Vireo, restricted access. Inside, he recalled, were photographs of confiscated canisters, pages of handwritten cipher logs, and receipts for chemical shipments stretching into the summer of 1945. The archivist claimed that within the box was a memorandum linking the discoveries to American black programs, particularly those under the Air Force's Weapons Evaluation Board. If true, it would explain why the Vireo files were marked as compromised by friendly forces. They had been absorbed into classified US research rather than neutralized. Soviet intelligence, too, had been watching. In declassified KGB briefings from 1951, the Americans were accused of seizing material evidence of German radiological prototypes and concealing them from international inspection. A specific claim alleged that in 1948, a US military convoy transported sealed containers from Frankfurt to Bremerhaven, where they were loaded onto naval vessels bound for New Jersey. Soviet analysts concluded these shipments formed the basis of unconventional radiological delivery trials, though no corroborating documentation exists. For historians, the puzzle lies in what was never recorded. No official Allied inventory lists the crates seized by Unit Vireo. The only surviving British record, FO 163294, contains a single typed line. All materials of Vireo are accounted for under joint custody. Yet joint custody was never defined, and follow-up pages are missing. Researchers who requested access to the files in the 1990s found them withheld under classification categories reserved for nuclear secrets, not conventional weapons. Among the most unsettling artifacts is a partially declassified interrogation transcript dated August 1947. The prisoner, a former SS engineer named Friedrich K., claimed to have worked at a hidden research installation near Gotha in Thuringia. His testimony describes rockets filled not with explosives, but with dust that poisons air and soil. When pressed on whether the weapons had been tested, he reportedly answered only, "The orders were to prepare, not to fire." The transcript ends with his transfer order to US custody. No record of his fate has ever been found. By the late 20th century, what remained of Unit Vireo had been reduced to whispers. Former OSS officers described it as a ghost unit, created to plug gaps in intelligence, but dismantled as soon as it discovered something inconvenient. What it truly uncovered, lost caches of Reich materials, missing scientists, or simply myths inflated by paranoia, remains obscured by missing files and deliberate erasure. But the language of its surviving reports is striking, urgent, fearful, and above all, unfinished. An operation that began with the promise of closure instead left a trail of missing crates, missing men, and missing answers. In March 1968, US Navy records quietly acknowledged an unusual recovery mission in the Baltic Sea. The operation, classified under the codename Project Grayfall, was logged as non-strategic salvage, a phrase so deliberately bland it concealed what would later emerge as one of the most disputed recoveries of the Cold War. According to fragments of declassified memoranda, the object in question was a German U-boat scuttled in the final days of World War II, one that had allegedly carried sealed canisters bound for South America. The wreck was first identified not by Americans, but by a Swedish fishing trawler that hauled up fragments of steel plating embossed with Kriegsmarine insignia. The coordinates placed the wreck in international waters east of Bornholm Island. Western intelligence had long been aware of scattered U-boats fleeing surrender, particularly those bound for Argentina under Operation Seawolf. But this vessel was different. Soviet intercepts of German naval traffic in May 1945 indicated a special transport heading north, not west. The implication was chilling. Cargo too sensitive to risk crossing the Atlantic might have been dumped in the Baltic instead. Navy divers from the USS Petrel were dispatched under secrecy in June 1968. Internal logs describe severe hull, compromise, forward torpedo bay destroyed, evidence of controlled scuttling. Yet the divers' medical files tell a more troubling story. Two suffered acute skin lesions, later diagnosed as radiation burns, despite no known reactor or nuclear ordnance aboard German submarines of the era. The discrepancy was noted in a Restricted Bureau of Medicine report, stamped not for general distribution. Officially, the injuries were attributed to exposure to corroded chemical munitions. Photographs taken during the dive, since leaked in poor quality, depict large cylindrical containers lashed within the wreckage. Their surfaces bear stenciled markings: an eagle, a swastika, and a series of numbers beginning with AG. Historians suggest this may denote mercury, a substance the Reich hoarded during late war attempts at advanced weapons. However, no official naval inventory acknowledges the recovery of such containers. The only surviving line, in a heavily redacted after-action report, states, "Cargo secured, transferred to vessel under Atlantic Command jurisdiction." At the same time, Soviet submarines were patrolling the Baltic. GRU files, declassified, in the 1990s, reveal that Moscow had shadowed the American operation. One report describes sonar interference that disrupted Soviet tracking equipment, forcing withdrawal. The notation added by a Soviet analyst remains enigmatic. Signal profile inconsistent with known submarine hull, object of uncertain origin. Whether this referred to the U-boat itself, its cargo, or American retrieval methods has never been clarified. Theories about what Grayfall actually recovered range widely. Some claim the containers held uranium oxide, part of the Reich's fragmented nuclear program. Others point to the mercury, potentially tied to exotic propulsion experiments rumored in SS engineering circles. A darker theory suggests the cargo was biological, sealed canisters of weaponized agents that the Reich had been preparing for dispersal. Yet no trace of such materials has ever surfaced in Allied scientific archives, despite decades of combing through captured German research. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence is a handwritten log recovered from the wreck by Navy divers, later smuggled to the West German press in the 1970s. Written in fractured German, it references Transportauftrag 1219, Südamerika, not möglich. Befehle geändert. Ladung sichern im Meer. Translation: Transport Order 1219, South America, not possible. Orders changed. Secure cargo in the sea. The entry is dated May 4, 1945, 2 days before the official German surrender. Whoever issued the order intended the materials never to leave Europe's waters. Why then did the US Navy expend resources 2 decades later to retrieve them? A memorandum from Admiral Rufus Taylor, then Deputy Director of the CIA, hints at the answer. Dated September 1968, it states, "Materials recovered from Baltic, consistent with ongoing technical evaluations. Integration into controlled programs underway. Public disclosure unacceptable." The phrase ongoing technical evaluations aligns with other black programs of the era, particularly radiological dispersal studies conducted under joint CIA-DoD projects. Once again, evidence points not to disposal of Nazi remnants, but assimilation into post-war American research. The Soviet Union, unsurprisingly, viewed the mission as theft of shared wartime spoils. KGB analyses accused Washington of weaponizing German discoveries, echoing accusations made earlier about Operation Paperclip. A 1971 internal Soviet memo even suggested that the Americans had recovered an object not of German manufacture, though the phrasing may have been a deliberate exaggeration meant to alarm the Politburo. Nevertheless, Soviet interest in the site remained intense. For years afterward, Warsaw Pact navies conducted repeated sonar sweeps in the same waters, though no further wrecks were logged. For decades, Project Grayfall remained little more than rumor. Then, in 2006, a former US Navy officer disclosed that the containers had been transferred to a facility in Maryland, where they were catalogued not as naval salvage, but under the Department of Energy. According to his account, the materials were never opened in full. Their seals were considered too unstable. Instead, the containers were stored in underground bunkers, awaiting eventual safe disposal. Yet no official acknowledgement has ever been made. The truth of Grayfall lies buried under layers of redaction, rumor, and denial. A U-boat scuttled in the Baltic, a cargo never meant to reach Argentina, and divers whose injuries hinted at something far more dangerous than rusting, steel. The official records may speak of non-strategic salvage, but the surrounding silence, the vanished cargo, the erased inventories, the contradictory testimonies suggests otherwise. What the Americans pulled from that wreck was not merely debris of a lost war, but a fragment of history that neither side of the Cold War dared to fully confront. On October 3rd, 1946, inside a dimly lit annex of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, a little-known tribunal was convened under the designation Case File Ravenwald. Unlike the headline trials, this proceeding was closed to the public, attended only by a handful of Allied legal officers, scientific advisors and translators. Its focus, testimony from captured Luftwaffe and SS personnel regarding wartime experiments in atmospheric modification, what the tribunal transcripts themselves chillingly referred to as climate weapons. The origins of the file trace back to early 1945, when British radar operators stationed at RAF Ventnor on the Isle of Wight reported anomalous sky distortion. The logs described the sudden collapse of coherent radar returns during storms that appeared artificially uniform, moving in grid-like patterns rather than natural flows. Intelligence officers initially dismissed the observations as instrument error, but when interrogations of captured German pilots mentioned weather squadrons, British analysts began cross-referencing their reports. The connections led to a quiet Allied investigation into a program the Germans themselves allegedly called Project Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt. The Ravenwald Tribunal assembled technical witnesses from the Luftwaffe's experimental divisions. One, Oberstleutnant Erich S., admitted under oath that aircraft had been modified to disperse chemicals in high altitudes. According to his testimony, the chemicals were intended to influence precipitation, fog density, and in some cases thunderstorm formation. He described ionisierende Geräte, ionizing devices, mounted on the undersides of Junkers aircraft, powered by generators stripped from radar installations. The objective, he claimed, was to create artificial weather patterns that could blind Allied radar, delay bomber missions or ground naval operations. Though many tribunal participants assumed exaggeration, supporting evidence emerged in the form of requisition logs retrieved from a Luftwaffe depot near Hamburg. These logs listed deliveries of silvered particulates and ionizing filament assemblies between September 1943 and February 1944. Cross-referenced with British meteorological data, investigators noted unusual storm clusters in the North Sea during the same periods. One report even suggested a correlation between the disruptions and aborted Allied bombing runs over northern Germany. Perhaps most disturbing were fragments of correspondence discovered in a half-burned file cabinet near Kiel. Among the surviving papers was a memo from SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, already notorious for overseeing secret weapons projects. Dated February 1944, the memo referenced Wetterbeeinflussung als taktisches Mittel, weather influence as a tactical measure, and urged accelerated trials before the invasion season. Whether Kammler's push translated into operational use remains uncertain, but the existence of such a document gave Ravenwald investigators serious pause. Despite the mounting evidence, the tribunal's conclusions never reached the public. The official transcript, still preserved in US Army Judge Advocate files, breaks off abruptly after 312 pages. Entire sections covering cross-examinations of German meteorologists are missing. A final entry reads only, "Session recessed. Indefinitely. Proceedings classified under Supreme Headquarters Directive." The Allied command decided disclosure could fuel dangerous speculation or inspire other nations to pursue similar experiments. Post-war scientific missions, particularly those under Operation Lusty, quietly pursued the leads. At Wright Field, in Ohio, American engineers analyzed fragments of the ionizing emitters recovered from Germany. A 1947 Air Technical Intelligence report noted no immediate military applicability, but admitted that atmospheric perturbation remains an area warranting controlled study. The devices themselves vanished into classified storage. Meanwhile, Soviet archives, declassified in part during the 1990s, reveal that the Red Army's Scientific Technical Directorate also investigated rumors of German weather modification, assigning it the codename Zarya 19. Their conclusions echoed the West: limited evidence but troubling potential. The secrecy surrounding Ravenwald may have been driven not only by technical curiosity, but by fear. Historians analyzing fragments of the transcripts point out that Allied officers expressed open alarm that the Reich had even contemplated manipulating natural forces as a weapon. The precedent, one British official remarked in a note, is more dangerous than the capability itself. Such fears led to a joint decision between US and British authorities. Ravenwald was to be sealed, all associated documents placed under 50-year classification. When the release date of 1995 arrived, the files were quietly extended to remain closed. Yet not everything stayed hidden. In 2001, a researcher combing through misfiled US Army Signal Corps records discovered several photographs originally attached to Ravenwald. They depict a modified Dornier d'Eau 217, fitted with large cylindrical tanks mounted beneath its wings, connected to cables leading into the fuselage. Another shows technicians handling long rods labeled Strahlgerät. The photos, though grainy, lend visual weight to the tribunal's testimony. Within months of their rediscovery, the originals vanished from the archive, surviving only as photocopies circulated among scholars. The last tangible piece of Ravenwald evidence emerged in Poland in 2010, when an abandoned warehouse near Gdynia yielded a rusted crate marked with Wehrmacht inventory codes. Inside were fragments of tubing coated with silver residue and a partially legible technical manual titled Anleitung für Wetterbeeinflussung Flugversuche. Though badly degraded, the manual contained diagrams nearly identical to those described by Oberstleutnant Erich S. decades earlier. Once again, questions arose. Were these experiments ever more than trials, and had they reached operational deployment? Ultimately, Ravenwald remains one of the most suppressed chapters of the Nuremberg aftermath. Officially, there was no tribunal, no testimony, no weather weapons program. Unofficially, too many fragments align: British radar logs, Luftwaffe requisition records, Kammler's memo, Allied confiscations, and missing transcripts. The secrecy itself has become evidence of what the Allies feared most. Not that the Reich had succeeded in controlling storms, but that it had seriously attempted, leaving behind prototypes and data that others could one day weaponize. More than 75 years later, the storms of 1944 are remembered only in obscure footnotes and whispered among archivists who have seen the Ravenwald file. A tribunal that began in secrecy, ended in silence, and left behind only questions. What, exactly, did the Allies uncover in those transcripts? And why, after all this time, does the record still remain sealed? In April 1953, French military engineers surveying a bomb-damaged district of Strasbourg uncovered a reinforced steel door beneath a collapsed warehouse near the Rhine. The structure led to a network of underground chambers that had survived both Allied bombing and post-war reconstruction. Inside, stamped onto concrete walls, was the emblem of the SS Technical Division. The French designation for what they had found was immediate: Kommando Nachtjäger, a unit already rumoured in scattered Allied intelligence notes for its work on infrared and night-fighting technologies during the Reich's final years. The Strasbourg bunker was unlike ordinary Wehrmacht storage. Its corridors were lined with dehumidifiers and electrical cabling that suggested an archive facility rather than munitions depot. In its deepest vault, investigators discovered hundreds of canisters of unprocessed film stock. The reels were labelled only with inventory codes: Versuch 17, Versuch 22, Optic 9. 6 reels were intact. The rest had been destroyed by fire that appeared deliberate, the spooling metal containers charred but not melted. French army reports later concluded the blaze had been set from within, possibly by retreating SS personnel. The intact reels were transferred to a secure military laboratory in Paris. Viewing them revealed stark, silent footage of weapons trials in occupied Czechoslovakia. The images showed Panther tanks fitted with unfamiliar equipment, tubular devices mounted above the main gun, connected by wiring into the turret. Accompanying sequences displayed Wehrmacht infantry carrying rifle-mounted optics with glowing lenses, crude precursors to modern night vision scopes. Captured date slates indicated the tests had been conducted in February and March 1945, months before Allied intelligence acknowledged Germany possessed such technology. French intelligence noted the devices bore resemblance to the ZG-1229 Vampire system, a rare infrared sighting unit documented late in the war. But the Nachtjäger footage suggested a more advanced stage, with vehicle-mounted arrays capable of targeting at distances exceeding half a kilometre. Test logs depicted live-fire exercises against mock Allied convoys, with accuracy far surpassing unaided night engagement. In one sequence, engineers adjusted dials on a generator mounted to a half-track, powering banks of infrared lamps that bathed the test range in invisible light. The clarity of the strikes, preserved on black and white film, was undeniable. Within weeks, the reels were no longer in French custody. A NATO memorandum, dated July 2, 1953, records that the material had been transferred for joint evaluation under US supervision. No French archive today retains the footage, and subsequent official statements claim only fragments remain. What precisely was learned from the reels, or whether the technology influenced NATO research into night optics, remains classified. Not all traces vanished. A surviving French army report, unearthed in 1998, describes the bunker's catalogue ledgers before they too disappeared. Entries referenced Project Nachtsichtgeräte Serie B and Experimentelle Optik 1944-45. Several lines were struck through with red pencil, annotated only with the word verbrannt, burned. A few were marked Übertragenen Kammler, linking the project once more to Hans Kammler, the SS general who had overseen numerous secret weapons initiatives and whose fate remains uncertain. What happened to the destroyed reels is a matter of conjecture. Engineers at the site in 1953 insisted the fire damage was inconsistent with aerial bombardment. The flames had been too localized. Instead, it appeared the canisters had been deliberately doused with accelerant and ignited before being abandoned. The question is whether the arson was meant to erase evidence of failure or to prevent discoveries from falling into Allied hands. The 6 surviving reels, removed to Washington, were never publicly acknowledged again. Declassified CIA correspondence from 1961 hints that the reels were reviewed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, during a classified optics symposium. One memo describes demonstration of Reich infrared apparatus footage and notes its potential relevance to emerging Starlight scope programs. Yet beyond that, references vanish. Requests under the US Freedom of Information Act return only standardized denials. No records responsive to this request. For Strasbourg itself, the discovery left an enduring mark. Civilian workers recalled that days after the bunker's opening, French military police sealed the site, and within weeks, construction crews poured concrete to permanently entomb the lower vaults. A rumor circulated among locals that strange, electrical devices had been removed under tarps, escorted by American personnel. No photographs of the devices were ever released, though one blurred image surfaced in a French journal in the 1970s, showing what appeared to be a tank-mounted searchlight with unfamiliar wiring. To this day, Kommando Nachtjäger occupies a liminal place in the catalogue of Nazi secret weapons. Unlike the rocket programs or jet fighters, its existence is confirmed only through scattered documents and the ghostly reels that vanished into NATO custody. What remains undeniable is that by 1945, the Reich was on the threshold of deploying battlefield night fighting systems that could have blunted Allied air and armor superiority. How far those systems advanced and why their evidence was buried so deeply are questions left deliberately unanswered. 70 years later, Strasbourg's underground chambers are quiet, their entrances bricked over, their significance omitted from tourist maps. The 6 reels survive only as references in lost files, their images remembered by the few who viewed them under military supervision. In those flickering frames lies a vision of a war that could have been fought in shadows, illuminated not by daylight, but by the cold glow of infrared lamps. A war glimpse too late and then erased. The evidence does not rest. It lingers, unfinished, pressing against the cracks of official history. Faded photographs, half-burned files, sealed containers no government admits exist. What if the war never truly ended, only changed its disguise? These shadows still breathe, and in their silence lies a warning. The truth was not lost, it was locked away, and somewhere, behind vault doors and buried shafts, it waits for the moment we dare to look again.